Now, I'm happy to say that after 1976, the British government began to seriously think about the situation instead of simply reacting to events. And over the years after 1968, a more coherent strategy emerged. And that strategy can be considered under three headings. Questions relating to security, and that involved what we call normalization, Ulsterization, and the development of intelligence. Secondly, social amelioration, tackling the social and economic conditions and addressing the grievances that minorities had. And then thirdly, seeking a political solution agreeable to the parties in Northern Ireland. And what I want to do is, rather than going through the matter in detail, is to take those three headings and look briefly at them thematically, and then try to come to some sort of conclusions or reflections maybe towards the end. The first one I mentioned was the security matters. And indeed, as the comments were made at the earlier session, that the security forces are very important in terms of giving space and opportunity for people to develop other solutions. I'll take it that far, and I don't want to take that argument further than that. A normalization involved initially ending what was called internment, the provisions whereby people were held without trial, which had been the stock response to trouble in Ireland by the British state ever since the late 18th century right through to the 20th century. And whatever arguments there may be about internment working in some situations, in the situation we had in the 1970s, it clearly wasn't working. And so that was wound up. And recourse was then had to, as it were, the criminal law and the criminal courts, although they were tweaked. There were changes made in terms of creating new offences, and there was a very important change made with regard to the operation of the courts, in that juries were dispensed with and the courts were presided over by a single judge, the so-called diplock courts. Some people outside of Northern Ireland got a bit excited about the diplock courts. Not many people within Northern Ireland did, because I think they recognised fairly soon that the diplock courts delivered a better quality of justice than juries had done. And the diplock courts continue in Northern Ireland in appropriate circumstances, and it doesn't give rise to any controversy at all. Miscarriages of justice did occur with regard to our troubles. Most of the miscarriages of justice occurred as a result of jury trials. And there's only one clear established case of a miscarriage of justice in the diplock courts. I don't exclude the possibility there may have been others. Ulsterization, as the term was used, was also a question of police primacy. Up until the late 70s, the army had effectively displaced the police, and from then on the policy was to try and get the police back as the primary agents with regard to administration and so on, backed up by local volunteer forces, army forces, the Ulster Defence Regiment, later the Royal Irish Regiment. This was because local people with local knowledge are going to be more effective than persons who don't know the community and speak with a different language that you'll get, or sorry, a different accent. You'll get a different response with that matter, and that does actually help. One consequence, unfortunately, of Ulsterization is that it then offered the IRA a whole lot of soft targets in the shape of off-duty policemen and UDR who could be attacked at home, and were attacked at home, and there were very significant casualties suffered as a result. But that, mind you, backfired on the IRA in that attacking people in their homes sort of, as it were, revealed or emphasised the essentially sectarian character of the IRA's campaign. So while it caused, as I say, a lot of casualties and quite a lot of hurt to the community, the normalisation, the Ulsterization, using local police and locally recruited soldiers was actually a good element in it. The third element I mentioned was in question of intelligence. Now, this is crucially important because if you're dealing with any sort of terrorist situation, gaining intelligence is hugely important. And in order to gain intelligence, of course, there are various electronic surveillance, and it's not to be underestimated, I can tell you. Having had my telephone tapped on a number of occasions, the only thing I have in doubt is as to which organisations were tapping my telephone, but that's another one. Mustn't assume if it's tapped that it's only done by the evil government. There are other people involved in doing that. But anyway, that's by the way. As I say, electronic surveillance can do an awful lot, but the most effective is actually human intelligence. And if you're going to recruit human intelligence, it is easier to do it if you've managed to convince the target population that the cause of the government is essentially just and the cause of the terrorist is not just. And in order to do that, you have to have it where that there has to be what I would call an ideological war, that the government needs to identify the ideology that's driving terrorists and to publicly combat that and to convince the population, as I say, that the terrorists are wrong and the government is right. And when you reach that situation, then it becomes much easier to recruit terrorists. And I'll come back to that later. But by the late 1980s, the government were claiming that they were managing to foil 4 out of every 5 operations that paramilitary groups attempted to launch. And there's no doubt that was the case. Now, by then, but it took time to reach there. The second theme deals with the amelioration and removal of grievances. In the 1970s, the economic situation in Northern Ireland was pretty grim, partly due to world conditions, but also due to the circumstances within Northern Ireland. Unemployment peaked at over 20%, and the place in the 1970s looked pretty grim. It was not a happy place to be, and a lot of people, as it were, voted with their feet in that respect. But if you come forward 15 years into the early 90s, it was a different situation entirely. During the early 90s, most years, Northern Ireland economy grew at double the United Kingdom average. Unemployment and GDP per capita, which up until then had always been higher, unemployment higher, GDP lower in Northern Ireland than in any other part of the United Kingdom. But by the mid-90s, we actually had a situation where we overtook some regions in Wales and England. And that remains to be the case. And it's quite a remarkable change. Jobs were being created mainly through local small businesses. There wasn't any major outside investment at this time, actually. There had been at other times, but most of the increase in jobs at that time were being generated locally with local small businesses. Jobs were growing at a considerable rate then, higher at that stage than in the Republic of Ireland. The explosive growth that the Republic of Ireland experienced actually came in the mid to late 1990s, and it's turning a little bit sour now, and we hope that our situation doesn't get as difficult as well. But nonetheless, the point being made here is that when you get to the early mid-1990s, the economic situation is quite different. The place looks different. There's so much more investment in the area that it gave quite a different atmosphere and feel to situations. There are 2 other factors of a general nature that one needs to bear in mind. If we're comparing 1970 and 1990, one of the things that happened then is that the context changed. This is partly due to the European Union. The United Kingdom and the Republic of Ireland both joined the European Union in the early 1970s. And in the atmosphere generated by the development of the European Union meant that by the 1990s, the existence of old-fashioned territorial nationalism and territorial claims being made by one EU member and another EU member were just inappropriate. In particular, the Republic of Ireland benefited from membership of the European Union and effectively reinvented itself in those 20 years as a modern Western European country, moving miles away from the old traditional Irish Republican ideology, so famously summed up by De Valera in the 1930s. By the 1990s, it was a different place, and it was in a different position with regard to militant republicanism than it had been earlier. And another factor which we were not very happy with, but the Anglo-Irish agreement that was entered into between the British government and the Irish government in 1985 and imposed upon unionists without consultation or seeking consent, had the effect actually of giving to Northern nationalists confidence that governments would no longer ignore their interests, even though the Anglo-Irish Agreement didn't deliver for nationalists all the things they thought it would do in 1985, partly because of the extent of the unionist reaction to it, leading to the British government having second thoughts and realizing the desirability of having agreement from both sections of the community. Nonetheless, it did give a greater sense of confidence to Northern nationalists and helped to get at that basic sense of alienation that there had been at the start of the Troubles.